Another day, another banger. Today we'll be diving straight into the Undisputed franchise. This video will recap all 4 movies, and without further ado, make sure to sit back, relax, and as always, enjoy the recap. Undisputed begins with 2 inmates boxing in the California inter-prison boxing program, when 2 other prisoners walk into the crowd. One of them is Jesus Chuy Campos, a former member of a Mexican gang who was convicted of multiple grand thefts, while the other one is Mendy Ripstein, a mobster convicted of tax evasion. Ripstein tells Chuy about Lewis, the best heavyweight boxer in 1937, who was targeted by the government for taxes. Sweetwater Prison houses 750 prisoners and staff, most of whom gather to watch the boxing matches, which have very loose rules. For the final match, Vern Van Zant, who was convicted of heinous crimes including murder, steps in the ring as the commentator announces that Vern has been undefeated with 8 wins. But now he faces Sweetwater's undisputed Monroe Hutchin, who hasn't been defeated even once in the past 67 matches. Just as the match begins, the commentator Marvin Bonds, a con artist, asks the convicts to avoid any incidents and focus on the fight. Monroe starts with slight jabs when Carlos Villarreal, a Mexican mafia boss, also joins the crowd. Monroe manages to punch Vern in the stomach, causing him to fall, but he manages to stand up, so Monroe goes straight in and knocks Vern out. Meanwhile, Chuy tells Mendy that the Iceman will arrive at 2 p.m. the next day. Marvin announces Monroe's win and tells everyone that the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, George Iceman Chambers, will arrive at Sweetwater tomorrow. On the other side, a news channel holds an exclusive interview with George, where the reporter questions how he plans to maintain his boxing skills while being detained for the next 6 to 8 years in the Sweetwater prison. However, George believes it will do no damage as he will stay in shape, saying that everyone knows he is the champion with or without the titles. While George is transported to the prison using a helicopter, he thinks of his glorious moments as the undefeated holder of the WBC crown. He remembers how he defeated Carlos Manfredi, the biggest name before him, and got fame for it. After which he challenged the next opponent named Montel and announced that he would party till the next season is up. Soon after, a woman testified against him, causing George to be convicted of rape. However, George maintains his innocence, saying he has done a lot of wrong things in life but would never stoop this low. Meanwhile, an inmate named James Ratbag Croyek, convicted of arson and homicide, talks to Monroe about George having his helicopter service instead of coming by the bus like everyone else, and Monroe comments on the champion status of George. Once George reaches inside the prison, he is told by the warden that over 170 requests have been made for a private interview with George, but all of them have been turned down. They explain that he will only get privileges if he doesn't cause any incidents in his first 6 months, and George remembers lashing out at the reporter because he asked George to apologize for the crime he didn't commit and work for a settlement. George is moved to his cell, where he meets his roommate Mingo Pace, convicted of carjacking and manslaughter. He considers it an honor to share the cell with George, but George orders Mingo to inform everyone not to approach him. After a while, they are visited by Ripstein and Chuy, where Chuy explains that Ripstein knows a lot about boxing. George comments on how his manager Louis Yank told him about Ripstein, but Ripstein denies knowing any Yank and comments that people often use his name without knowing him. He claims that Monroe, Sweetwater's boxing champion, could easily beat George, arguing that the former champion isn't as sharp as he was before. At lunch, as all the prisoners are present in the mess, George asks Mingo to point out Monroe and goes to him. He asked Monroe if he is the champion of this place, and Monroe explains that they have a program where they get to fight every 6 months or so, and he has been on top for the past 10 years. George congratulates him, and then suddenly punches him in the face, starting a fight that the guards quickly rush in to break. George is taken to the warden, who tells him that he isn't going to add this incident to his official record. But George remains arrogant, saying that he is the most famous man in the world, so if they penalize him, they will have the whole world against them. The warden realizes George is just an arrogant thug, but having no other option, he orders Monroe to be put in solitary confinement for contributing to the violent situation. The general administration officer named Darlene explains to the head guard that punishing Monroe is unfortunate, but that is the only way to maintain peace until arrangements to send Monroe to another prison are made. Meanwhile, new duties get posted, and George gets the kitchen duty along with Mingo. So he asks Mingo why he is in prison, and Mingo explains that it's against prison etiquette to ask people about their crimes. George notices Ratbag, who considers himself Monroe's assistant, and provokes Ratbag to hit him and start a fight to show his dominance. When Ratbag finally hits him, George hits back harder, making him fall down, before ordering Ratbag to tell Monroe that only George is the real champion. George heads to his kitchen duty, where he and Mingo talk about how Mingo got in prison for stealing a Mercedes, while George flaunts that he has 3 of them. On the other side, Darlene interviews Monroe to process his transfer to another prison, and he explains that he has always been in control of his emotions, except for the one time when he lost control and got sent to prison for it. He denies any responsibility in the recent incident and tells Darlene to interview George for his behavior. He states that he isn't scared of George because they both are fighters, adding that every fighter eventually loses. On the other hand, George is visited by his manager, who tells him that since his title was stripped, there's an elimination tournament to determine the new champion, and everyone thinks Briscoe will win it. The manager hopes that they get George out of prison, and he fights Briscoe in the final to win the championship again. When George speaks badly about the fan base he has lost, his manager tells him to value them as they are the ones who pay his bills. Meanwhile, Chewie is visited by caretakers of Ripstein, and he tells them that Ripstein remembers things from the past very clearly but forgets who Chewie is almost every day. They instruct him to care for Ripstein, having paid a large sum for the service. Chewie explains that since taking the job, he's secured Ripstein an oversized ground floor cell, food privileges, and a relaxed dress code. On the other side, in the washrooms, George hits another inmate named Willard Bechtel, who was convicted of drug trafficking and murder. After that, George is visited in the prison by his lawyers, who tell him that the woman has filed a lawsuit for $75 million and that the government has ordered an audit, making George wonder if any of this will be covered in the $2 million he paid to them. The lawyers tell him that if he exhibits especially good behavior, he can get parole after 2 years, which angers George. But the lawyer adds that George's financial situation is a mess as well. His only path to financial survival is getting out of prison and returning to the ring. Meanwhile, Monroe reminisces about his past as a heavyweight boxer, where he won the California Championship in 1990. Back at the center, George is visited by a female lawyer who is handling his civil lawsuit. George maintains his innocence, claiming the encounter was consensual, and refuses to offer any settlement money. When he goes back to the facility, he encounters Antoine Bonnet, convicted of prostitution, who says that Saladin from the El Faziz assassins sent him as a gift, which prompts George to visit him. Saladin tells George that they work as a united group, but George hits Saladin in the face before going in to hit almost everyone on his team. As a result, George is chained, and the head guard takes him to the warden. The warden expresses disappointment at George hospitalizing 5 men, saying he's building a terrible record, but George insists he's only trying to survive while establishing his dominance. Meanwhile, Monroe, being cool and collected, has built a whole hut using toothpicks and remembers the time when he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for beating to death a man who was sleeping with his girlfriend. The next morning, Chewie goes to Ripstein, who asks him how the preparations for the fight between Monroe and George are going. Ripstein says that Monroe can beat George, which will get them a lot of money, as all boxing champions can be beaten. The head guard agrees to the match, and Ripstein calls his people outside the prison, who persuade the warden to let the fight happen when he is off duty for 2 weeks. The warden tells the head guard to ensure there is no video evidence of the fight and that the whole underground boxing ring is destroyed after this fight. Darlene notes how conveniently the warden arranged his trip after receiving a call from the governor's office, and she also applies for vacation to avoid getting caught up in the mess. George calls his manager, Louis Yank, and tells him that Ripstein wants him to fight a boxing match in return for which he will help him get out of prison early. Yank acknowledges that Ripstein is influential but quickly asks about the opponent. When he learns it's Monroe Hutchin, he warns that Monroe will be difficult to defeat, given his undefeated record before imprisonment. This angers George, who believes that he can easily defeat anyone in prison. On the other side, Ripstein calls for Monroe and tells him that he got him out of solitary confinement, but Monroe demands 50% of the betting money if he wins the match. Ripstein says he will only give 10%. But Monroe explains that he has a sister outside who has 3 children and no income, so he wants to help her, and they negotiate till Ripstein agrees to give Monroe 40%. Next, George goes to visit Ripstein and clearly states that he wants to get out of prison in return for fighting, so Chewie explains that they have a guy in the Department of Corrections, and Ripstein agrees to his demand. As both fighters start to prepare for the big day, Yank is allowed inside the prison to help George practice. Ripstein gives them a set of rules and Yank tries to negotiate, suggesting they use gloves since bare-knuckle fighting limits the number of punches thrown, and Ripstein agrees to 6-ounce gloves. 24 days before the fight, George confronts Monroe in the shower room, asserting that he's the only true champion. Monroe doesn't back down, declaring himself the champion of Sweetwater, which forces George to walk away in anger. 16 days before the fight, all the prisoners in the mess hall start banging their cups on the table in a rhythmic motion, making the head guard realize a riot is brewing and quickly call for backup. The inmates, tired of George's arrogant behavior, gang up on him and start chanting Monroe's name, saying that every single prisoner wants to see George fall. However, before things can escalate, the backup shows up and holds back the group from charging at George. This causes the warden to cancel the match, which enrages Ripstein, and he tells Chewie to call the warden for a meeting. Later, the warden arrives but refuses to reinstate the fight, so Ripstein tells him a story about a casino that was to be shut down by a mayor. The underground mafia gave the mayor a choice: death or a large sum of money in his account. The warden understands the threat and agrees to leave for his vacation, allowing the fight to take place in his absence. 7 days before the fight, Chewie is visited by Ripstein's syndicate, who instruct him to fix the fight in Monroe's favor as heavy betting is going his way. They tell him to offer George $1 million, but Chewie refuses, saying that Ripstein wants a fair match. 6 days before the fight, Saladin and Carlos visit Monroe and tell him that they know a guy in a dispensary who will steal a few minor tranquilizers and mix them in George's meal before the fight, so Monroe can have an upper edge, but Monroe refuses it, saying that he can beat George on his own. On the fight night, both men visualize victory as they prepare, and the head guard asks the inmates to move to the fight zone. The outside observers arrive with police escorting them, and the commentator Marvin starts the show with the national anthem. The fighters enter the ring, and Marvin explains the rule that if a fighter goes down, he has 60 seconds to get back up and they fight till one is knocked out. He then introduces the fighters extravagantly, and the head guard marks the beginning of the fight. They both move to the center of the ring, but Monroe is defensive,
Right hand, left, right.
and George manages to corner him with multiple jabs,
Hard right hand. Yeah.
and eventually George lands an uppercut that drops Monroe. The head guard marks it as the first round, but Monroe manages to stand up again within 60 seconds. The second round begins with George missing several hits, allowing Monroe to land an overhead right. However, George quickly regains control, unleashing a barrage of attacks, and a final blow to the head drops Monroe, ending round 2.
He's talking shit.
Monroe is shaky but manages to stand up again, while Ratbag motivates him to turn the fight around. Round 3 begins with George fighting aggressively, landing multiple hits that make Monroe stagger, but Monroe makes a surprising comeback with a left hook. Monroe drives George back against the cage and uses multiple combinations before finally putting George down with a right-hand punch for the first time in his career, sending the crowd of prisoners into a frenzy. George ignores that the round has ended and gets up to attack Monroe, nearly getting himself disqualified until Yank jumps into the ring and restrains him. Round 4 begins with both fighters trading punches evenly. Monroe gains the upper hand with a devastating combination, a right punch, a left to the stomach, then an overhead right. Monroe hits him repeatedly, and with one strong punch officially KOs George to become the undisputed champion.
Blows to the head and the body. Say what you want to say about George Iceman. Check another left and a right and an overhead right.
The crowd goes wild, loudly chanting Monroe's name while Monroe stands emotionally with his fist in the air, and Ripstein calls the match a thing of beauty. Later, Chewie narrates that Ripstein died 3 weeks after the fight, but he kept his word as George was released on special parole while Monroe received his promised money. Ripstein also left Chewie $2 million in his will. 11 months later, George and Yank denied that the fight with Hutchin ever occurred, dismissing it as a rumor. The fight for the championship between Briscoe and George is televised in the prison, where George wins back the title of heavyweight champion of the world. The entire cell block erupts in laughter and cheers Monroe's name upon hearing George crowned the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, while Monroe quietly continues his hobby of building things with toothpicks. Undisputed 2 Last Man Standing begins some years after George's fight with Monroe Hutchin, and now the ex-champion is in Russia for filming a commercial. He dislikes the work because it requires him to speak Russian, but his manager Phil tells him he has no other choice, as he is no longer the world champion and he needs money. Meanwhile, in a maximum security prison named Kornia Cholmy, a fighter named Yuri Boyka gets ready for his mixed martial arts fight, which is televised in a club owned by a man named Gaga, where people bet money on each fighter. The commentator introduces Arkady Davik, convicted of second-degree homicide with 14 wins, facing Boyka, convicted of 3 counts of first-degree homicide, who is the undisputed champion of the prison for the past 34 fights. The rules are very loose and the fight begins with both parties landing attacks, but Boyka makes Davik fall with a 720 kick to the head. However, Davik stands again, so Boyka uses a step-up kick before launching a barrage of kicks on his opponent. When Davik stands again, they exchange punches before Boyka picks Davik up and slams him to the ground and sits on top of him to punch him till he is bleeding badly. On the other side, George reaches the hotel only to be met by Phil, who is angry at George being late for the dinner with the commercial executives. However, George doesn't care and tells him that he will join them after changing clothes. When George reaches his room, he finds 2 criminals planting coke there, and he gets in a fight with them. He manages to overpower them, until a third one appears and knocks him unconscious. Back in the ring, the referee jumps in to stop Boyka, but Davik stands up again, resuming the fight, so this time Boyka punches him before landing a swinging kick that sends Davik to the ground, and he finally celebrates his win. The people in the club get the money that they won, and Gaga's assistant comments on how they will have to close the club if they don't find someone who can defeat Boyka. Meanwhile, Phil finds George, and the hotel's security arrives quickly, but Phil comments that no one saw anyone entering or leaving this area. After the fight, Boyka is getting the tape around his wrist cut by another inmate named Kirill when Kirill accidentally hurts Boyka with the scissors. Boyka, instead of accepting that it was an accident, angrily pulls Kirill's hand ready to cut it, when he is interrupted by a man who tells him that the police are already in George's room, so he will be in prison by tomorrow. Once the man finishes his announcement, Boyka ruthlessly cuts Kirill's hand. At the hotel, George is arrested for possession of narcotics and sent to Kornia Cholmy to await charges. Upon his arrival, the prisoners gather to see him, especially Boyka, who angrily stares at George. He is then taken to the warden named Markov, who tells George that the prison has their championship, but George refuses to participate as he believes he will be released soon. George is given his clothes and taken to the shower room where he beats up 3 guards who refuse to provide hot water. But the head guard calls backup and George is forced to shower in the ice-cold water before being transferred to his cell. The next morning, George's cellmate named Stephen Parker wakes him up, asking him to get out of the cell or the guards will lock him in the room for the entire day. During mealtime, all the people in the mess hall stand up when Boyka enters, but George refuses to do so, resulting in one of Boyka's men approaching George to force him to stand up, but George just hits him instead. George next goes to Boyka, spits in his cup, and when Boyka claims to be the champion of the prison, George throws the water on his face. Boyka attacks George, but the guards quickly break up the fight. Boyka is angry at the guards stopping the fight, but the warden assures him that he will have his shot with George in the ring. George is visited by Phil, who tells him that his bail might take up to a month, which enrages George, as he was framed and now must survive in this prison. Meanwhile, Gaga visits the prison's warden and gives him a large sum of money to set up a fight between Boyka and George. On the other hand, George notices Stephen getting bullied, so he goes to help him and easily beats the bullies. Stephen thanks George before telling him that the entire place is owned by the mob boss named Gaga, and advises George to fight in the program. Soon, Boyka realizes that George has hit his men and openly challenges George to fight in the ring, but George refuses to have an official match, saying they can fight right now. However, the guards quickly break up the fight. Later, Kirill tapes Boyka's arms for a fight and tries to advise Boyka to forget about George for a while, but Boyka slaps him and tells him to focus on his job. The entire club bets on Boyka, infuriating Gaga, who calls the warden and tells him to ensure the next fight is between Boyka and George. The fight begins, and Boyka makes a roundhouse kick before launching multiple punches at the opponent. He uses knee strikes, which make the opponent fall, but he stands up again, and the two exchange punches before Boyka uses a spinning hook kick to make the opponent fall to the ground. When the opponent stands, he puts him in a headlock and slams him to the floor before kicking him and getting on top of him to punch him repeatedly. After defeating the opponent, he points at George, calling him to the ring. Later, when George is in his cell, the head guard arrives asking him to meet the warden, but he declines and attacks the guard. So the head guard quickly calls backup and they tie George before hitting him. The warden shows up and tells George that he can get an early release if he fights with Boyka, but George refuses, which results in the warden assigning him the demeaning physical labor in the prison sewer system. George is forced to work, and after work every day he has to take his shovel back to Krot, an old Russian inmate in a wheelchair. When George goes back to his room, Stephen explains that Krot was a commander in the Russian army and even killed a guard once, so now he is bound to stay in prison forever. Later at night, when Stephen is cleaning the hallway, he finds an opportunity to take drugs that the cafeteria worker smuggles for him, but he is found by Boyka's men. They give him pills, but one of them steps on Stephen's hand, threatening him to make George fight with Boyka. The next morning, when George goes to the sewer, he is met by Boyka's men who attack him. George tries fighting them, but he is outnumbered and they are about to injure him badly when Krot shows up. This distracts them, and George gains the upper hand as Krot starts attacking Boyka's men as well. The guards rush in and put George in a cage in the sewer as punishment, where he shivers from the cold. Eventually, Krot brings him medicine and food before giving him the reality check that it doesn't matter if he was framed, as they won't let him out of this prison. Later, the warden sets George free and he is walked into a room where Gaga meets him, clearly showing him that if George makes a wrong move he will be shot dead. Gaga says that he got George in prison and can get him out if he fights Boyka, but George refuses, saying that his manager Phil will get him out. However, Gaga calls Phil in the room, revealing that Phil is a part of the setup, who tells George to stop being stubborn. And George is furious but reluctantly agrees. They both start preparing for the fight, though George still relies on his boxing background while Boyka prepares a series of deadly kicks and throws. However, a day before the fight, Boyka's gang forces Stephen, who is acting as George's corner man, to spike his water during the fight. The day of the fight finally arrives, and George starts strong and pushes Boyka to the corner of the ring with a series of punches before throwing a body uppercut combination that makes Boyka fall for the first time in his career. But Boyka stands up. He launches a series of kicks in George's stomach before slamming him down. George tries to regain power, but Boyka does a flying split kick that makes George stagger. However, they both fall out of the ring, which causes round 1 to end. Stephen hands George the spiked water before the beginning of round 2, which makes him dizzy, and Boyka easily KOs him. The next morning when George wakes up, Krot tells him that he was drugged, so George angrily limps toward his cell only to find that Stephen's guilt got the best of him. George finds Boyka in the mess and calls him out for cheating, but Boyka denies it as he is unaware of it. The warden comes in and George demands release as he fought on that condition, but the warden denies knowing anything of that sort, so George punches him in the face. The warden chains George to the pole in the freezing prison yard as punishment, and the guards beat him up. Boyka calls his gang and kills 2 of them after finding out that they drugged George. Meanwhile, Phil gets a large sum of money from Gaga and is about to leave for America when he is shot dead by Gaga's enforcer. Back in prison, George shivers from the cold, causing various inmates to give George some clothing and food to keep him warm. The warden notices this and punishes them all to stand outside in the harsh cold. The next morning, George is taken back to the cell upon Gaga's instructions, who scolds the warden for putting George in such harsh conditions. Gaga tells George that he will set him free if he wins against Boyka, and George sets the condition that no drugs will be involved. When Gaga asks him if he has any other conditions, he tells Gaga to send warm clothes for all of the prisoners and happily watches them all receive jackets later after George practices for the fight. Krot visits him and tells him that he would need more than just boxing skills to defeat Boyka, suggesting that he can teach him a few things about military close combat that might come in handy. George initially refuses, saying that these fights are street style and he can handle them on his own, but after a while he realizes that he needs Krot's help and they start training together, with Krot teaching him how to break an arm if required. Later at night, Krot looks at a picture of his niece and plays an instrument, but quickly hides the picture when George walks in, so George apologizes and is about to leave. However, Krot stops him and explains that back when he was in the army his younger brother committed robbery, but because he had a promising future and a family, Krot decided to take his punishment. However, he was given only 4 years for the robbery, but the prison was too much for him, so he decided to escape, which resulted in a guard getting killed and Krot becoming paralyzed. Because of this, he was put in solitary confinement and given a life sentence, feeling connected to George. Krot reveals that his real name is Nikolai. The next morning, the two fighters get back to training hard, and Krot teaches George how to break the opponent's leg if it comes down to it. The day of the fight finally arrives, and Boyka tells his gang he will finally prove that he is the most complete fighter by defeating George again, while Krot advises George to leave as soon as the fight is over, so he doesn't get dragged into this mess again. George starts getting emotional, but Krot tells him to focus on the fight for now. Boyka and George enter the ring while Gaga and the warden sit in the audience. Everyone places their bets and the match finally begins. George, having prepared for Boyka's attacks, easily dodges his kicks until Boyka finally lands one on his stomach. George quickly regains power and corners Boyka before hitting him repeatedly, but Boyka pushes him away with another kick in the stomach. George soon manages to slam Boyka to the ground and punches him repeatedly, before pulling him up and slamming him again. The bell rings, ending the first round, and Krot praises George's style but asks him to use the new technique he has learned. Round 2 begins, and George lands a punch before defending multiple of Boyka's attacks. Boyka grabs George in a chokehold, but George throws his weight backward to drive both of them toward the corner, uses back elbow strikes before lifting him over his head and slamming him to the ground. Boyka, however, regains the upper hand and punches George in the stomach before pulling him to the ground and trapping George's leg between his legs to break it. However, George grabs Boyka's leg and flips them over before kicking Boyka in the face. Round 2 is over, and Krot tells George to finish Boyka or else he will rot in this prison forever, which makes George remember the hardships that he has faced. Round 3 begins, and George attacks Boyka right away by grabbing Boyka's arm and hitting the elbow, almost breaking it before punching his jaw. George makes another series of combinations before slamming him on the ground, and he manages to get Boyka in a joint lock. He remembers how Krot taught him, and ends the fight by breaking Boyka's leg, proving that he is the undisputed new champion of the prison. Gaga is immensely pleased and finally frees George before giving him a large sum of money as his cut and apologizing for making him stay in such unpleasant conditions. Gaga asks George to take a picture with him so he can show it to his nephew, but George refuses, saying he will never forgive Gaga. George is about to leave when he remembers something and rushes back to the warden's room. He presents his cut to the warden and makes a deal where he uses his winnings to buy Krot's freedom.
It's all right, Nikolai. You got a lot of time to let it sink in now.
Later, George wheels Krot to a train station to meet with his niece, where they reunite in a warm embrace. Undisputed III Redemption continues in the maximum security prison of Kornia Cholmy, Russia, as the announcer hypes up the crowd for a prison fight tournament. Meanwhile, Yuri Boyka, now having acquired a limp in his left leg, wipes the prison floors in a shabby state. He hears the commotion of the fight above as the Russian champion Vladimir Saikov fights an opponent whom he slams to the ground and then proceeds to finish him off with a brutal headlock, knocking him unconscious. Saikov celebrates with the warden Kus and the mob boss Gaga, who is investing in him. Moments later, as the warden and Gaga pass through a corridor where Boyka is wiping the floors, Boyka tells them that he dropped a bill. Gaga tells him to keep it, but Boyka dismisses it and walks over to his cell, but Gaga recognizes him as Boyka even in his disheveled state. The next day, Boyka is informed by the senior parole officer that his request for parole has been rejected for the next 15 years. This prompts Boyka to start training his injured leg, so he can fight again. While he starts training, Gaga visits his cell, offers him a better cell and working conditions. As he made Gaga a lot of money during his fighting years, Boyka rejects the offer, instead asking for the opportunity to fight in the tournament, which Gaga deems as dangerous and quickly rejects the idea. Sometime later, Saikov dismantles another opponent, and as he celebrates, Gaga notices Boyka eyeing him from below. Inside his cell, Boyka ramps up his training, lifting a bucket full of water with his leg and hitting the bad knee against a pillow tied to his metallic bed. He shaves off his wild beard and hair as the final step of his transformation. The next day, the announcer declares that the winner of the final fight will qualify for the Prison Spets competition, or PSC, with the ultimate reward of freedom from the prison. In the final, Saikov again dominates his opponent and knocks him out easily. But as he celebrates, Boyka throws a bucket full of water over him and challenges him to a fight. Gaga allows the fight as a final token of respect, but is shocked when Boyka's one left hook sends Saikov against the ropes, followed by a flurry of kicks and punches and finally a devastating kick to the abdomen that sends him out of the ring unconscious. As a result, it is Boyka who qualifies for the tournament and is transported to the Gorgon prison in Georgia. In the Gorgon prison, Boyka joins the other international prison fighters from all across the globe, while Gaga and the other mafia bosses sponsoring the fighters arrive at a luxury hotel in Tbilisi, Georgia, to meet the tournament organizer Rezo. Gaga comes across Joe Farnati, a mob boss from the USA who claims his fighter named Turbo would defeat all others with ease. While they discuss the matter, the fighters are introduced to prison warden Cuss, who warns them that they will be given no special treatment and punishes Turbo for his rude behavior. On the other hand, Rezo arrives at the hotel and presides over the gathering of the mob bosses to promote the PSC. As an endeavor with maximum profits and minimum losses, the next day, the prisoners are rudely awakened and told that they will get 1 hour for training. But before that, they will have to work, for which they are sent to a mining site. At the site, Turbo refuses to engage in harsh labor while Boyka works silently, causing an altercation between the two. But it is quickly broken up by the guards. All the while, one of the international prison fighters, Raul Quinones, watches from above the mine as he reads poetry instead of being subjected to harsh labor. Back at the prison, Boyka trains using a punching bag while Turbo resorts to weightlifting, and Boyka notices children's tattoos on Turbo's chest which seem to be his kids. Meanwhile, Raul is visited by Warden Cuss in his cell, which is relatively better than the rest, and hands him a box containing performance-enhancing drugs, revealing his favorable treatment. At night, Boyka prays while Raul is brought 2 prisoners to spar with in the main ring. He showcases brutal power and precision in dispatching both of them single-handedly with ease. The next day, the mob bosses arrive at the prison and bet on the fighters for the first round of the tournament. The first match is between a Greek, Petros Mavros, and a Brazilian, Andriago Silva, who uses capoeira fighting style and quickly beats his opponent with flying kicks, trips, and up kicks, finally finishing him with a powerful series of punches to the face. The next fight is between Turbo and a Croatian named Andre Krates. Turbo starts strong with super fast jabs and hooks, but the opponent quickly adjusts and uses kicks to counter Turbo's boxing, however. Turbo recovers soon and uses his boxing defense to negate the opponent's strikes and hits him with his attacks, finally ending it with a hook that knocks his mouthpiece out. It is followed by Boyka's showdown with a French prisoner who sees very little success against him, as he can't keep up with his mix of wrestling and brutal kicks that knock his teeth out. He finally finishes him with a drop kick and limps off. Finally, it is Raul's turn, whom Farnati reveals to be a psychotic Colombian drug trafficker known as Pain, who got busted in a trafficking beef. Raul faces a Korean fighter who uses taekwondo, but fails miserably as he is not able to land his kicks, and when he does, they have no effect on Raul, who ends him with a flying kick. Later, when the defeated fighters are recovering in the washrooms, they are confronted by Warden Cuss, who tells them their time in Gorgon is over and they will be transported to a remote location to be picked up by their escorts. But instead they are shot dead and cremated in an oven. A day later, while working at the mine, Boyka and Turbo again get into an altercation when Turbo tries to make small talk with him, but Boyka smacks him in return. A fight ensues in which both are equally matched and the guards don't interfere but watch until the fight gets to the ground. They are then taken back to Gorgon and locked in a torture cell where they have only enough space to stand. Turbo continues trying to engage in a conversation with Boyka, whereas the latter doesn't want to talk. Moments later, their sponsors arrive to bribe the guards to release them, and upon talking with their fighters they are enraged to discover that they are forced into harsh labor. So they furiously confront Warden Cuss in his office. Cuss, however, is backed by Rezo, who explains that he has rigged the competition in favor of Raul and reminds them it is his plan to make the most profits at minimum costs. Therefore, they should bet on Raul and enjoy the millions they get from the bets. Gaga and Farnati are won over by this proposition, and they all share a toast. The following day, Boyka and Turbo are working together in the mines and are again about to fight, but Turbo advises Boyka to calm down so they can avoid the torture cell and instead take out their grudges in the ring. Boyka agrees, and they start working together when Turbo notices that Raul is not sitting in his usual spot. Instead, he is in his room injecting steroids into his neck. Back at the prison mess, Turbo tries to get to know more about Boyka and asks him about the crimes he committed. However, Boyka doesn't give a clear answer, but the friendship between the two grows. Later at the mines, they converse while working and Turbo despairs at how the tournament is fixed. But Boyka does not mind since for him the fight is not only with those inside the ring but also with those outside. When they return from the mines, Boyka goes to the gym to practice, which surprises an exhausted Turbo, but this also convinces him to push himself to train, and as they work, Kuss observes them from afar. Meanwhile, Gaga and Farnati try desperately to liquefy their assets to get more money to bet on Raul. The next morning, Raul enjoys a premium breakfast in the mess, whereas Boyka and Turbo are not even allowed to have the usual breakfast. Instead, they are sent away to the mines on an empty stomach. Turbo is furious, but Boyka convinces him to look at it as training. Thus, they transform the mining work into strength and cardio training, and when Boyka's knee hurts, Turbo finds and gives him a therapeutic herb to heal it. Later, while they are having lunch, Boyka asks about Turbo's tattoos, prompting him to reveal his family as his source of motivation for winning the tournament. Whereas for Boyka, fighting is the only thing that can give his life meaning, since he considers himself the most complete fighter in the world, with a fighting ability bestowed upon him by God that must not be wasted. Before the semi-final bouts, Gaga secretly places a new bet while Boyka uses the oil from the herb on his knee in preparation for his next fight. The next fight is between Boyka and Andriago Silva, which proves to be a very entertaining match. Silva uses his capoeira skills to avoid Boyka's blows and almost traps him in an armbar. But Boyka escapes and increases his aggression. He is hit on the knee mid-fight and shows signs of pain, which alerts Raul. Boyka manages to recover in time and land devastating kicks on Silva and taps him out in a triangle choke. Following the fight, Rezo worries about Boyka and Turbo being too strong, which prompts Kuss to use the prison guards to beat Turbo up severely. The next day, Boyka eats at the mess alone and finds Turbo in a bad state in his room, but he promises to recover for their fight. Later, while Boyka is training, Raul arrives and mocks Boyka for his fall from grace as an underground fighter. Boyka doesn't hold back with insults, but Raul leaves with the threat to take Turbo's life in their fight. In the following days, both Raul and Boyka train to their limit, and when Boyka returns to check on Turbo, he finds his bed empty. Turbo is training in the gym, but Boyka notices that he is in pain and has slowed down considerably. However, soon the warden doubles their misery by sending them off to the mines. There, Boyka tries to convince Turbo to run away, but he thinks it is dishonorable. However, he is convinced when the old man who gives them food reveals that the defeated fighters are all killed and no one leaves this place alive. Boyka thus tries to break off their chains with a sledgehammer, but it snaps, and the guards attack them. However, they fight the guards and Boyka manages to get the keys off of a guard, which he uses to set Turbo free. On the other hand, Boyka is knocked out and finds himself chained to a wall in the prison, where Gaga reveals that he has shifted his bet to Raul because he thinks Boyka has no chance against him with a broken knee. The next day, Boyka has the final showdown against Raul, and the fight goes back and forth between the two until Raul lands a strong kick on Boyka that dazes him. As he tries to return a kick, Raul grabs Boyka's leg and snaps it, further injuring it. From then onwards, Raul targets the knee with leg kicks and starts to outright dominate the fight, landing devastating combos on Boyka and eventually throwing him flying off the ring with a kick. Raul starts celebrating his win, but down below, Boyka sees a mop, wraps it across his leg, and gets back in the ring before the 10 count, much to Raul and everyone else's surprise. Boyka, with his newfound resolve, proves to be tougher and starts to dominate, winning the crowd over and sending Raul to the ground before unloading a barrage of strikes on him. Raul traps him in a Kimura lock, which Boyka swiftly reverses, and upon getting up, Raul tries to kick his knee, but Boyka evades him and lands a strong punch on him, following it with several hard shots that hurt him badly. As they both lock eyes again, both attack simultaneously with their kicks. But Boyka meets Raul's shin halfway with his bad knee, snapping Raul's leg muscle and sending him to the ground screaming. The crowd goes quiet and Farnati storms away in frustration as the referee stops the fight. Gaga just sits there expressionless as Boyka points to him in celebration. Gaga then accuses Rezo of costing him $5 million and vows to eat his brain with a spoon as he storms out of the premises, while the crowd chants Boyka's name as he walks away. Moments later, Farnati enters Warden Kuss's office with a pistol and demands compensation. Meanwhile, Rezo and his associate enter from behind, whom he shoots dead, but he also gets shot in the back by Kuss. While Boyka is recovering in the washrooms, Kuss and his guards visit him and tell him he can't go free since they agreed upon the freedom of one prisoner, not two. Because Turbo has not been captured yet, Boyka will not be allowed to walk out of the prison as a free man. He is instead taken to the remote execution location under the pretense of sending him back to Russia, where Kuss praises his fighting ability as he is about to shoot him in the head. But at the final moment, Kuss and his goons are shot dead as Turbo comes out of the shadows. He quickly helps Boyka into a car waiting for them, which has Gaga waiting inside. Gaga hands a briefcase full of cash to Boyka, revealing that he bet on him instead of Raul, as he knew Boyka is the best fighter in the world regardless of injuries. Turbo now plans to work under Gaga and return to his family, while Boyka tells them to stop the car so he can leave. Before he leaves, Turbo thanks him and they share their first names, Yuri and Jericho, and make a promise of a fight in the future. As they leave, Boyka walks in the opposite direction before running and screaming with joy to celebrate his freedom. Several months after getting his freedom back, Boyka now fights in underground tournaments in Kyiv, Ukraine, where in the locker room Boyka contemplates the meaning of life before he steps into the ring. During the fight, his new manager Kirill and the crowd chant his name, as he goes up against another fighter, whom he easily picks apart until the fighter lands a punch on him, angering him and making him more aggressive than before. He dominates the guy and finishes him off with a fast-flying kick to the stomach, and then celebrates over the body of his defeated opponent. Back at Kornia Cholmy prison in Russia, the prison fights continue as a monstrous new fighter who has to be restrained by 4 guards with chains is brought to the ring to fight a much smaller man. The fighter, named Koshmar, shrugs off his opponent's strikes and easily overpowers him, slamming him onto the ground with a devastating throw that knocks him unconscious. However, Koshmar continues to attack his face with punches until he is dead. Back in Kyiv, Boyka visits a church and donates Bibles. The local priest thanks him for all his donations that helped build the church, but urges him to quit fighting, claiming that violence consumes men despite Boyka's insistence that it is only a sport with rules. Later, while he is training at the gym, Kirill arrives with the good news of securing him a legal fight in the European Divisional Tournament at Budapest, for which the scouts will observe him in his next fight. Boyka leaves happily and quickly starts preparing for the qualification fight. Just before the fight, Kirill warns Boyka about the skill of his opponent named Victor, and Kirill claims that Victor has the same hunger as him, but Boyka dismisses him and enters the ring. The fight starts and is closely contested by both fighters, while the scouts observe Boyka and are impressed by his skills. Gradually, Boyka gains control and drops Victor with a flying knee. But when the fighter wobbles to his feet, Boyka floors him again with a brutal punch, telling him to stay down.
Stay the f*** down.
Boyka then celebrates in front of the scouts, but is frustrated when Victor refuses to give up, making Boyka hit him with his most powerful punch and knocking him out for good. A moment later, he is visited in the locker room by the scouts, who praise him and hope to see him at the European Championship in Budapest, but also warn him that the result of his fight will decide his future. Kirill also congratulates him and hands him his winnings, but as he is leaving the building, he sees his opponent being carried out on a stretcher. Upon inquiry, he finds out that the man is in a serious condition due to a concussion. Boyka is disturbed by the news and cannot sleep peacefully all night, as he is reminded of the priest's earlier warnings. The next morning, he visits Kirill's office and discovers that his opponent passed away last night, and Kirill reveals Victor was from Drovny, Russia. Boyka goes through his belongings and finds a letter to his wife with their picture in it. Deeply saddened, he commands Kirill to get him a fake passport for Russia, despite Kirill's warnings that he is a wanted man in Russia and it can cost him his career and life. However, Boyka admits he's more worried about the afterlife than his current life. Sometime later, Victor's funeral is held at a community center in Drovny, when a mob boss named Zaurop arrives with his goons and confronts Victor's wife, Alma, demanding the money her husband owed him. Alma offers to work for him to pay him off, but Zaurop implies that he is more interested in her rather than her work. Back in Kyiv, Kirill gets Boyka a fake passport by the name of Anton Luganov, but advises him not to go. However, he knows that Boyka would not listen to him, so he instead advises him to keep a low profile and travel in a minivan rather than commercial buses to avoid unnecessary attention. Boyka does as he is told and gets into the country with little difficulty. Sometime later, Boyka gets off at Drovny and lounges in a hotel, placing a cross on the wall of his room and going out to the community center to meet Alma. However, Zorab's men arrive at the center and they take her away to work for Zaurop. Later, Boyka discovers that Alma works at Zorab's club, which hosts underground fights, as 2 men fight viciously while the crowd cheers. One of the fighters, Igor Kazmir, snaps the other's leg and knocks him unconscious with a flying kick to the head. Meanwhile, Alma is working as a waitress with apparent discomfort, as Zaurop observes her through the camera feed in his office. Boyka has eye contact with her, and she inquires if he is following her, but before he can say anything, Zorab's guards grab him and take him outside. They warn him to stay away, but they get into an altercation when he insists on seeing Alma. During the fight, Boyka easily defeats multiple guards and Zaurop approaches to offer him a position as his fighter in his club, but Boyka refuses and asks to see Alma instead. Zaurop dismisses this, claiming to own her in the city, and threatens him to leave, while also ordering his men to keep an eye on him. The next day, Boyka again visits the community center, and as Zorab's guard tries to stop him, he knocks him out with a single punch and enters the building, where he finally gets to talk to Alma. He hands her Victor's letter, for which she thanks him, and she reveals that she and Victor took a loan from Zaurop for opening the community center, which she now has to pay off. But when Boyka reveals he accidentally killed Victor in their fight, she furiously rejects his help and tells him to leave with his blood money. On his way out, Boyka again knocks out the guard when he regains consciousness. Moments later, he barges into Zorab's club while he is looking for a champion fighter, and Boyka offers to fight for him in return for Alma's freedom. They agree on 3 fights in 1 week, as Boyka wants it done as soon as possible. Later in his hotel room, Kirill calls him and requests that he return for his fight in Budapest, but Boyka tells him to delay it as much as possible. As he leaves the hotel for the gym, Alma approaches him outside and tells him to leave her alone. However, Boyka admits that he is not there to win her or save her but to save himself. At the gym, Boyka is approached by a strong-looking fighter who stops him from using the punching bag and tries to pick a fight with him. But before he can do so, Boyka knocks him out with a kick to his chin, thereby establishing dominance in the gym. Later at the club, Boyka gets ready for his first fight and faces a local fighter, with the fight going back and forth between the two until Boyka's shoulder slams the opponent to the ground and lands a decisive blow on the abdomen to win the fight. He is about to continue the assault on the helpless fighter but restrains himself at the final moment. As he walks away, the local champion Igor reminds him that he is the best there, and Zaurop also warns him that future fights won't be easy. Moreover, Zaurop sends Alma to the locker with a drink for Boyka, where he asks her to suggest a place to train since the local gym is overrun with rats. So Alma invites him over to the community center, where he trains in a small room as the kids watch him curiously. When he goes near Alma's office to get some water, she tells him that Victor used to train day and night in the same room. The next day, Boyka is surprised when his next match is turned into a 2-on-1 handicap match by Zaurop. The fight proves very difficult, as he has to fight the Ozerov brothers, and he initially does well, which gets Alma interested in the fight, but is slowly overwhelmed by the pressure and taken by surprise when one of his opponents dropkicks him on his back, sending him against the ropes in pain. However, seeing Alma motivates him to fight through the pain, so he dominates the brothers, knocking one out with a dropkick and finishing the other by dropping his full weight on him. Zaurop is concerned about this performance and warns Igor to be ready, but he shrugs it off. Boyka then limps off the ring in the applause of the audience as Alma gazes at him with newfound hope. Meanwhile, in his office, Zaurop bribes the local police chief Koichev, offering him more money to get Koshmar released from Kornia Cholmy for a fight. When Koichev calls it a very difficult task, Zaurop offers him information about the whereabouts of Yuri Boyka as a bonus in addition to the money. At night, Boyka returns to the community center and starts training immediately, although with a lot of pain and discomfort in his back. Alma thus prepares an ointment for him with her grandmother's recipe and applies it on his back to relieve his pain. While she is doing this, Boyka urges her to just leave town, but it gets her furious as she tells him how it was her and Victor's dream, without which the children would fall into gangs and crime. Back at Zorab's office, he asks his bodyguard Slava if he has discovered something unusual about Boyka's training or his relationship with Alma, but Slava has nothing to report. Moments later, Zaurop visits the community center and approaches Alma, touching her inappropriately, to which she protests, making him think that there might be a relationship between her and Boyka. He tries to slander Boyka in her eyes as the cold-blooded killer of her husband, but Alma refuses to believe it. Zaurop then tries to be a bit stupid but is pushed away, which enrages him and causes him to toss her and orders her to throw Boyka out of the community center. The next day, as Boyka is going back to his hotel, Kirill calls and tells him that the bout is ready for him in Budapest with his name on every fan's tongue and his face on every poster, so he must get on the bus before 9:45 p.m. Boyka reassures him of his return, and when he enters his room he finds Alma there, who demands he tell her about his fight with Victor. Boyka is reluctant, but upon her insistence he tells her how he has committed a multitude of horrible crimes and fought in hundreds of underground fights with only the dream of being the most complete fighter in the world driving him through life. He confesses that Victor stood between him and his dream. Thus he had to defeat him, but he did not intend to kill him. Alma is appalled by this confession, and she leaves the room in tears. The following night, Boyka has his last fight, which starts at 9 o'clock, giving him 45 minutes to finish it all off and head to Budapest on the bus. However, Igor proves to be a tough test for him, as he matches Boyka in not only speed but also in skill and uses an illegal strike to the groin to floor him, following with a kick to his injured back. From then onwards, he targets his back repeatedly and dominates Boyka. But just when they count him out, Boyka steps up to the occasion and overwhelms Igor before knocking his mouthpiece out with a left hook and finally knocks him out with a spinning kick to the face. As the crowd cheers, Boyka checks the time, and it is around 9:25 p.m. So he quickly goes to his locker to get ready to leave. But Zaurop approaches him and tells him he now has to fight his champion or else their deal would not be through, and Alma's debt would remain. Boyka is frustrated by this trickery and is informed by Kirill on the phone that the last bus to Budapest leaves at 10, and missing it would make him miss his fight in Budapest. But Boyka assures him he will be done before 10. Moments later, 4 men escort the chained Koshmar into the arena, accompanied by the Kornia Cholmy warden, who sits with Zaurop to watch the fight. During the fight, Koshmar shrugs off Boyka's attacks while landing devastating strikes of his own, culminating with a knee to the face that knocks Boyka unconscious. However, he beats the 10 count and has another go at Koshmar, who again floors him with a throw. But Boyka continues to fight and lands his first strong kick on him, following with a leg lock to hurt Koshmar's leg and further hindering him by snapping his arm in an armbar. Finally, Boyka sends a limping Koshmar flying out of the ring unconscious with a dropkick. However, Boyka's celebrations are cut short as Zaurop forcefully drags Alma away. His men simultaneously attack Boyka with baseball bats to delay him until the police arrive. They beat him unconscious, but Alma's screams wake him up and he takes the guards out and fights through the gunfire, taking a couple of bullets but killing Slava in the process. He then follows Zaurop outside where he is trying to get away in a car with Alma as a hostage. However, Alma bites his hand, giving Boyka a chance to tackle Zaurop to the ground and choke him to death. As Boyka lies bleeding from his gunshots, Alma urges him to get up so they can escape from the police and avoid his arrest, but Boyka instead asks Alma for forgiveness. However, she cannot bring herself to say anything and the police arrive to arrest him and take him back to Kornia Cholmy. 6 months later, Alma visits Boyka in prison and tells him that she has forgiven him and thanks him for restoring her dignity. As Boyka walks back to his cell, he feels redeemed, having finally overcome his guilt. Sometime later, the crowd chants his name again as he enters the fighting ring in the prison and celebrates himself as the most complete fighter in the world. Thanks for staying until the end as usual. I appreciate you guys more than you can fathom, and I wish you nothing less of an awesome day. Take care.